rural landscape in his Symphony No. 3. After 1947, Samuel Barber sets his Knoxville, summer of 1915, to James Agee's memoir of his childhood in rural Tennessee. 1989, Elliott Carter's Three Occasions for Orchestra celebrates the vigor and energy of America. 1999, John Harbison composes The Great Gatsby based on F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel. In August 1944, the dancer and choreographer Martha Graham first heard the music that Aaron Copland had created for her ballet Appalachian Spring, about a young couple ready to embark on married life in a Pennsylvania farmhouse in the early 1800s. She was pleased with what she heard and praised its power to lead the listener into a singular world. Graham commissioned the work, determined that it would be a legend of American living and the inner frame that holds together a people. She had also stipulated that the music should be about 90 minutes long and scored for only 10 to 12 instruments, but Copland used 13. Graham had also chosen the title Appalachian Spring, which came from a verse of the dance by the American poet Hart Crane. So long as the human spirit thrives on this planet, music in some living form will accompany and sustain it and give it expressive meaning. Aaron Copland. Clarity and simplicity. Copland's music had been heavily influenced by his time as a student in France in the early 1920s, when he had been surrounded by people who represented all that was new in the arts. In Paris, several young composers were newly reworking classical styles and exploring genres such as modernism and impressionism, eschewing the old German romanticism of Brahms and Wagner. Copland himself was particularly influenced by Igor Stravinsky, who was just entering his neoclassical phase. Stravinsky's octet impressed Copland with its clean lines, crystal-clear textures, and concise structure. From this time, Copland's music became more open and its form and instrumentation more tightly controlled. The hardships of World War I compelled him, like Stravinsky, to write for smaller orchestras. With Appalachian Spring, he said, he was forced to say what he had to say in the simplest possible terms. What Graham had requested was perfectly captured in his skeletal musical language that created a rich sense of space hitherto unknown in American music. Martha Graham performs as the young bride in Appalachian Spring at a New York theater. The music, which Copland also reshaped as an orchestral suite, won him a Pulitzer Prize in 1945. Emotional inspiration. Copland found his theme for the work in the first line of a Shaker hymn, "'Tis the Gift to be Simple." The Shakers were an American Protestant sect known for their plain way of living. The clarity of texture suffuses the ballet, its warmth flooding the entire score, from the opening sense of dawn breaking over a Shaker farmstead. The music perfectly captures the tenderness of young love, the gaiety and buoyant dances of the ensuing wedding, and the most magical moment of all, the ending of the ballet, when the newlyweds, alone for the first time, realize the sheer immensity of what they have done. They are pioneers, about to start their life together in a new country. Although they are safe in their home, they must tame and cultivate the unconquered land stretching out before them. These mixed feelings of comfort, awe, fear, optimism, vulnerability, and courage were transformed by Copland into pure, deeply moving music. Aaron Copland. The son of Russian immigrant parents, Copland was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1900. Studying in Paris with the composer Nadia Boulanger, he came under the influence of Prokofiev, Stravinsky, and Poulenc. In collaboration with Roger Sessions, he ran the Copland Sessions concert series to encourage young American composers. His own music brought him worldwide fame in the 1940s, although his later serialist works were less well received. Copland taught at the New Berkshire Music Center in Massachusetts from 1940, and in 1951 he became the first American composer to be appointed as Harvard's Norton Professor of Poetry. Around this time, he was falsely accused of communist activities. In 1960, he moved to Rock Hill, New York, where he lived until his death in 1990. Other key works: 1930 Piano Variations, 1942 Fanfare for the Common Man, 1967 Escape. See also, Prélude à l'après-midi d'un faun les sacres du printemps les bitches Romeo and Juliet. In context. Focus. 20th century British opera before. 1689 First performance of Henry Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas. 1871-1896 Librettist W. S. Gilbert and composer Arthur Sullivan together produced 14 comic operas, including HMS Pinafore and The Mikado. 1902 Edward German's opera Merry England, a tale of amorous rivalries at the court of Elizabeth I, opens at the Savoy Theatre in London. 1922 Following the success of his orchestral suite The Planets, Gustav Holst composes his one-act opera The Perfect Fool. After 1955 Michael Tippett's first opera, The Midsummer Marriage, is performed at Covent Garden. 1966 The one-act opera Purgatory, by Hugo Weisgall, premieres at England's Cheltenham Festival. 1968 The Aldeburgh Festival includes the first performance of Harrison Birtwhistle's opera Punch and Judy. 1984 Where the Wild Things Are, by Oliver Nussin to a libretto by Maurice Sendak, receives its first performance at London's National Theatre. After Purcell's death in 1695 and on through the 18th and 19th centuries, British music was dominated by European composers such as Handel, Johann Christian Bach, and Mendelssohn. It was not until the publication of Edward Elgar's Enigma Variations in 1899 that a British composer began almost single-handedly to revitalize the country's music. At this time, British opera was in an especially perilous state. The comic operas of Gilbert and Sullivan were popular, as was Edward German's operetta Merry England, but there were no serious successors to Purcell. Elgar would never finish The Spanish Lady, his only attempt at opera, while Vaughan Williams labored for years on his first opera, Hugh the Drover, working folk songs and idioms into the music in the hope of creating a truly British work. When the opera opened in 1924, it met with little initial success. The young Benjamin Britten disliked the English pastoral school and wrote of Vaughan Williams, "I am afraid I don't like his music, however much I try." Britten had hoped to pursue postgraduate studies with the Austrian composer Alban Berg, a student of Arnold Schoenberg, whose lyric suite he admired, but was dissuaded by his parents. In 1930, the year Britten began his studies at the Royal College of Music in London, the Vic Wells Company was formed in a bid to champion British theatre, opera, and ballet. In 1934, the Old Vic Theatre became the center for spoken drama and Sadler's Wells the headquarters for opera and ballet. Britten felt passionately that his country should have a permanent national opera company and believed the Sadler's Wells Opera Company, which later became English National Opera, was a good first step. The beach at Aldeburgh, the coastal village that inspired Peter Grimes. The opera was staged live here in 2013 to mark the centenary of Britten's birth. Music has the beauty of loneliness, of pain, of strength and freedom. The beauty of disappointment and never satisfied love. Benjamin Britten. I wanted to express my awareness of the perpetual struggle of men and women whose livelihood depends on the sea. Benjamin Britten. Inspiration for Grimes. During World War II, Britten and his partner, the tenor Peter Pears, a fellow pacifist, spent 3 years in America. While there, Britten read George Crabbe's poem The Burrow, published in 1810, in which Crabbe devotes a whole section to the villain Peter Grimes, a murderous outcast, who is hunted down by his community. The long poem depicts the people of the Suffolk town of Aldeburgh on England's east coast and describes the local flat landscape, the marshy terrain, the stony beaches, and the suck and surge of the waves. It moved Britten so deeply that not only did he decide to use the story of Peter Grimes as the subject for opera, but he also determined to return to his native Suffolk. In spite of the danger and difficulties of crossing the Atlantic in wartime, he and Peter Pears traveled to England on a cargo vessel, the Axel Johnson. During the 19-day sea journey, they worked together on the libretto for the new project, surrounded by what Peter Pears described as callous, foul-mouthed, witless recruits for company. Such a setting for the beginnings of Britten's first serious opera was apt. The sea would form a haunting backdrop in Peter Grimes. Back home in Suffolk, Britten worked further on the libretto with the writer Montague Slater. Britten, a deeply sensitive man, wanted to explore the character of Crabbe's murderous outcast. Britten felt himself to be an outsider in society, and not only because of his pacifism. He had first met Peter Pears in 1937, and the two suffered because of their love for one another, homosexuality being illegal in Britain until 1967. The soprano Joan Cross plays the schoolmistress, Peter Pears is Peter Grimes, and Leonard Thompson is the apprentice in the original 1945 production of the opera. Benjamin Britten. Born in Lowestoft, England, in 1913, Britten played the piano and composed from an early age, studying with the composer and violinist Frank Bridge in his teens. In 1930, he won a scholarship to London's Royal College of Music. From 1939 to 1942, Britten and the tenor Peter Pears lived in America. On their return to London, Pears joined the Sadler's Wells Opera Company, whose theatre premiered Peter Grimes in 1945. The success of the opera excited interest in every new work by Britten. Britten and Pears formed the English Opera Group in 1947 and in 1948 launched the Aldeburgh Festival. In 1962, Britten's War Requiem was premiered in the newly rebuilt Coventry Cathedral. Britten was made a life peer in 1976, a few months before he died of heart failure. He was the first composer or musician to be made a member of Britain's House of Lords. Other key works. 1946 The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. 1951 Billy Budd. 1961 War Requiem. Ovations for a Masterpiece. The first performance of Britten's Peter Grimes took place at the Sadler's Wells Theatre on June 7, 1945. The composer and conductor Imogen Holst, who was later a co-director of the Aldeburgh Festival, recalled the thrill of the occasion. "No one in the audience will ever forget the excitement of that evening," she wrote. When the tragedy had reached its quiet end and the opera was over, she sensed that the audience knew they had been listening to a masterpiece. They stood up and shouted and shouted. The popularity of the opera lay partly in its psychological drama and depth of characterization. A complex, lonely, and tormented fisherman, Peter Grimes has just been cleared of the death of an apprentice but is warned not to seek a replacement. Faced with the townspeople's hostility, Grimes yearns in vain for love and simple domesticity with his friend Ellen Orford, a widowed schoolmistress, but the relationship is halting. In the prologue's duet The Truth, The Pity, and The Truth, Ellen sings in the bright E major chord while Grimes begins in F minor. Gradually, Grimes gives way to Ellen, and the pair are in unison, but it does not last. In defiance of local opinion, Grimes procures a new apprentice, and his fate is sealed. When Ellen spots a bruise and accuses him of mistreating the boy, local people see Grimes strike her then leave. Forming a lynch mob, they advance on Grimes's clifftop hut to a drum beat suggesting impending doom but find nothing amiss as Grimes is away fishing. His apprentice, however, has fallen down the cliff to his death. His jersey is later found washed ashore, and the mob advances on the hut once more. Doomed, Grimes rows out to sea and sinks his boat. The opera ends the next morning when, to the mournful sound of a foghorn, reports emerge of a sinking vessel too far out to be rescued. He wished for one to trouble and control. He wanted some obedient boy to stand and bear the blow of his outrageous hand. Peter Grimes. Building tension. The music of Peter Grimes has astonishing tensile strength, what Peter Pears called the bare minimum of notes to convey the maximum effect. Such economy of style, already apparent in Britten's early works, such as A Boy Was Born and Less Illuminations, was skeletal compared to the English pastoral school of composition. In Peter Grimes, the music expresses the drama at all times. In the quartet High, Give Us a Hand, in the first scene of Act 1, for example, all four characters sing at the same time, mimicking an argument, while the mix of song, speech, and laughter in the choruses Assign Your Prettiness to Me in Act 3 conveys the natural simplicity of the villagers. Conversely, at the end of the opera, the canon of the chorus evokes the menace of the crowd. Orchestral interludes are also employed to great effect between acts, especially in the 4C interludes, which are often performed on their own. They serve to set the scene, evoke the emotions of the characters, and foreshadow the building drama, from gentle violins and flutes depicting a coastal dawn to an upsurge in the brass denoting an approaching storm. Britten went on to write other operas, including Billy Budd based on Herman Melville's novella Billy Budd, Sailor, and Death in Venice, from the novel by Thomas Mann. In addition to carving a place for modern British opera in the international repertoire, Britten actively promoted music and fellow composers. He also upheld the traditional elements of opera, such as a good story, evocative atmosphere, and a large and stirring chorus. Essentially, he reclaimed the concept of opera as entertainment in an age when minimalism ruled. Britten is memorialized in a window by John Piper in Aldeburgh Parish Church. The burning fiery furnace, depicted here, evokes Britten's three church parables. Music festivals. Aldeburgh Festival, launched by Britten and his friends in 1948, gained international status within a few decades. It became the latest in a growing number of international music festivals, including the Bayreuth Festival founded by Richard Wagner in 1876 to stage his own operas, and Salzburg's Festival of Mozart's Music, founded by its citizens in 1877. In Italy, it was the centenary in 1913 of Verdi's birth that prompted the first operas at the Arena di Verona, where the city's annual festival is held in summer. As in Europe, classical music festivals in the U.S. flourished in the 1870s, though the Handel and Haydn Society in Boston held its first triennial festival as early as 1858. In the 20th century, the composer Henry Kimball Hadley staged concerts in 1934 that evolved into the celebrated Tanglewood Festival. See also, Dido and Aeneas Tosca Peer Gynt the Wreckers, A Child of Our Time. The English opera group carried props into the Jubilee Hall for Britten's Let's Make an Opera during Aldeburgh's 1949 festival. Introduction. In the wake of World War II, classical music became increasingly experimental as composers searched for more adventurous ways to rework the language of music. Turning their back on the past, they looked to new sources of inspiration, such as mathematics and physics, and overturned former concepts of structure. They even questioned fundamental aspects of music, such as what constituted a musical instrument, the necessity of a performer, and what music itself can be. In Europe, the post-war generation pushed the serial method of composition pioneered by Arnold Schoenberg in the 1920s further by applying the technique to volume and duration as well as pitch. Encouraged by Olivier Messiaen, their teacher at the Paris Conservatoire, Pierre Boulez and Karlheinz Stockhausen became the leading lights of serialism, while Iannis Xenakis used it as a starting point for a music that was based on a combination of mathematical and acoustic theories. Composers also found rich inspiration in technology, which provided access to a whole new sound world. In Paris, Pierre Henry and Pierre Schaeffer pioneered a technique known as musique concrète, using sounds recorded onto magnetic tape as their building blocks. At the same time, a young American composer, John Cage, explored music determined by chance, or aleatory music, and examined the musical potential of silence. He determined key elements of his compositions by tossing coins and sorting yarrow sticks or giving ambiguous graphic instructions to performers. One of his works specified 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, in which only the ambient sounds of the auditorium could be heard. Ideas spread. After the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, news of these fresh developments began to reach composers behind the Iron Curtain, where the Soviet-dominated regimes had censored music that it considered degenerate or subversive. Georgi Ligeti, born in communist Romania, made his way to the West via Hungary in 1956 and developed an idiosyncratic style after coming across the music of Stockhausen and his contemporaries, eventually finding inspiration in chaos theory and fractal mathematics. As restrictions on the arts lifted in Poland, Krzysztof Penderecki and others leapt at the chance to create a new musical language, composing pieces for conventional instruments in blocks of sound reminiscent of electronic music or, like Witold Lutoslawski, they introduced elements of chance into their work. This eclectic approach to musical composition, incorporating elements of different styles, was also a feature of the music of Luciano Berio, who embraced musical collage. The birth of minimalism. Much of this new music perplexed and alienated listeners, and in 1960s America, there was a reaction against it. In place of complexity, some young composers advocated simplicity or minimalism. pioneered by Terry Riley and given fresh impetus by Philip Glass and Steve Reich. The style was characterized by repetition and the most basic of harmonies, partly inspired by the hypnotic qualities of some African and Asian music. A number of composers encouraged improvisation by the performers. In Riley's NC, the order, duration, and tempo of the composition are determined by the musicians. Cross-cultural trends. In the late 1960s, as political, social, and technological horizons widened, the fusion and cross-fertilization of musical cultures became increasingly evident, as in the work of Toru Takemitsu, who composed for Western and Japanese instruments, and the cross-cultural music of Kaya Sariaho. Classical composers also absorbed ideas from popular culture, incorporating elements of pop and rock music as well as jazz into their work, while also embracing the possibilities of new technology. British composer Thomas Ades's In 7 Days, for example, is a multimedia work, while American composer Eric Whitacre has explored the possibility of virtual ensembles assembled via the Internet. It is too early to say which direction classical music will take in the 21st century or what the next musical movement will be. But history suggests that composers will continue to find many new means of musical expression. In context. Focus. Electronic music and musique concrète before 1939. The first example of electroacoustic music, John Cage's Imaginary Landscape No. 1, uses variable speed turntables, frequency recordings, muted piano, and cymbal. 1948. Made entirely from recordings of steam trains, Pierre Schaeffer's Études aux chemins de fer is broadcast alongside his other early studies in sound. After 1952-1953. Olivier Messiaen composes his only electronic work, Timbres de Riz, although he later withdraws it. 1954. Edgar Varèse's Deserts, which alternates sections of musique concrète with others scored for an orchestra of wind and percussion, is broadcast from Paris on December 2. 1956. In Gesang der Jungling, Stockhausen mixes sounds derived from the voice of a treble choirboy with manipulated electronically generated tones. 1958. Edgar Varèse writes Poème électronique for the futuristic Philips Pavilion, a building designed by Le Corbusier, at the World's Fair in Brussels. In the aftermath of World War II, composers were among the many creative figures who sensed a need for a new aesthetic. They sought to create works that would not be tainted, as they felt complex state-sponsored orchestral music and opera were, by any connections with previous regimes, particularly the Third Reich, its allies, and the countries it had occupied. Some turned to forms of serialism developed from the organic structures of Anton Webern, an earlier exponent of serial music and one of the composers whose work had been denounced as degenerate by the Nazi Party. Others found a new beginning by recording ordinary, everyday sounds and putting them together into collage-like compositions that merely needed to be played on a disc or a tape, rather than interpreted by live musicians in a concert hall. This was the origin of musique concrète, an early form of electronic music. It was at the Studio d'Essai de la Radiodiffusion Nationale that Pierre Schaeffer began work on the Symphonie de Brutes. Founded in 1942 by theater director Jacques Capot and his pupils as the center of the resistance movement in French radio, the studio subsequently became the cradle of musique concrète. In collaboration with Pierre Henry, who joined the electronic studio in 1949, Schaeffer developed his original symphonie into the Symphonie pour un homme seul, premiered at the École Normale de Musique in Paris in 1950. Henry went on to run what was eventually called the Groupe de Recherche de Musique Concrète, the body that studied and developed musique concrète from 1951 to 1958. Something new has been added, a new art of sound. Am I wrong in calling it music? Pierre Schaeffer. Pierre Henry, in concert in Paris in 1952, used 4 large circular receiver coils to show how sound transmitted through 4 loudspeakers could be shifted around a listening space. The sounds of a life. In its original form, the Symphonie consisted of 22 movements using turntables and mixers. For a broadcast in 1951, this number was reduced to 11, but then increased to 12 for Henry's 1966 revision, which has become accepted as the official version. The symphony is an explorative work utilizing recorded sounds and new techniques in a relatively simple and also somewhat crude manner when compared with what would later be achieved in the field of electronic music. The first and seventh of the 12 movements of Henry's 1966 revised version are titled Prosopopée 1 and Prosopopée 2, from the Greek rhetorical term prosopopeia, in which a speaker communicates in the guise of someone else. Other movements are given musical terms, such as valse and scherzo. Two are evocatively named erotica and eroica, and a further two, collective and apostrophe, suggest verbal exchanges. Stret, the title of the last and longest movement, like the Italian term stretto, which is often used to describe fugues or operatic finales, indicates a faster speed or richness of texture as earlier sounds are reprised. In his 1952 work, À la recherche d'une musique concrète, Schaeffer described the individual nature of the work and also listed some of its sonic elements. He declared that a man could be his own instrument, using many more than the 12 notes of the singing voice. He cries, he whistles, he walks, he thumps his fist, he laughs, he groans. His heart beats, his breathing accelerates, he utters words, launches calls, and other calls reply. The choreographer Maurice Pijart, who sensed the further expressive potential of the symphony, used it as a score for the dance piece that was also called Symphonie pour un homme seul, which he created in 1955. It was Pijart's first success and has been revived several times. Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry. Born in 1910 in Nancy, Schaeffer grew up in a family of musicians. He, however, studied engineering and received a diploma in radio broadcasting from the École Polytechnique before joining the French radio and TV broadcasting company Radiodiffusion Télévision Française in 1936. In 1949, Schaeffer met Pierre Henry, a composer and percussionist, born in Paris in 1927, who had studied at the Paris Conservatoire with the composers Nadia Boulanger and Olivier Messiaen. Together they formed the groupe de recherche de musique concrète, remaining close collaborators until 1958 when the more prolific Henry left to found his own independent studio called Applications de Procédés Sonores and Musique Electroacoustique. Henry continued to write electronic scores for films and ballet, as well as his incomplete La Messe de Liverpool, an electronic mass commissioned for the opening of Liverpool Cathedral in the UK in 1968. Schaeffer composed little more, although he continued writing and teaching. His pupils included Jean-Michel Jarre, a pioneer of electronic music. Schaeffer died in Aix-en-Provence in 1995, aged 85. Henry died in Paris in 2017, at the age of 89. Other key collaborations. 1950, La Course au Kilocycle. 1953, Orphée 53, 1957, Sahara d'Aujourd'hui. The soundtracks and effects for most programs made by the BBC were mixed in the control room at Alexandra Palace, London, until the early 1950s. Sounds used in the 12 movements of Symphonie pour un homme seul. 1. Prosopopée. Knocking, shouts, humming, whistling, and wordless singing. 2. Partita. Mostly someone playing a prepared piano. 3. Valse. Made up of the distorted sounds of an orchestra playing fragments of a waltz with various voices over the top. 4. Erotica. A woman's voice laughing and purring with pleasure. 5. Scherzo. Conversational speaking voices played at various speeds and alternating with detached sounds from the piano. 6. Collective. Relaxed voices over soft, sustained piano chords. 7. Prosopopée 2. The sound of footsteps alternates with various pitches from the piano. 8. Eroica. Busy clattering sounds with a voice played backward. 9. Apostrophe. Male and female voices repeat lyrical phrases against short rhythmic ideas on the piano. 10. Intermezzo. Sounds like fragments of a collective prayer against a tense, percussive accompaniment. 11. Cadence. Sounds of knocking on wood and metal. 12. Stret. A loud, eruptive opening, then a summary of what has gone before, with percussive sounds, crowd noises, and sirens. A musical legacy. Although Schaeffer was appointed professor of electronic composition at the Paris Conservatoire in 1968, he composed few works after 1962. He continued, however, to pursue a vast range of artistic interests and concepts, especially creative writing, theoretical studies in musique concrète and other electronic techniques, and the organization and running of groups dedicated to the new genres. Henry went on to explore the medium he had helped to invent in collaboration with Bijart, the choreographer Alwyn Nicholas, his fellow composer Michel Colombier, and the British rock band Spooky Tooth. His work also influenced composers of multiple electronic music styles, including the British musician and producer William Orbit, Matt Ducasse of the UK-based band Skylab, and the UK music producer and DJ Fatboy Slim. Other composers who worked briefly at the Groupe de Recherche de Musique Concrète included Karlheinz Stockhausen, Pierre Boulez, and the veteran Edgar Varèse, who recognized the advent of a medium that he had longed for all his life. However, the main contributions to the genre born in Paris were made elsewhere. In 1952, the German theorist and composer Herbert Eimert inaugurated a department for electronic music at the radio studios in Cologne. Stockhausen joined him there, and their focus moved from sounds recorded in diverse contexts to sounds that were electronically produced. Between 1953 and 1954, Stockhausen wrote two influential studies in pure electronics before going on to combine real sounds with electronics in his masterly Gesang der Jungling. An opera for blind people, a performance without argument, a poem made of noises, bursts of text, spoken or musical. Pierre Schaeffer. Describing the Symphonie in La Musique Concrète. New experimental spaces. Studios similar to those in Cologne began to open across the world in New York, Tokyo, Munich, and in Milan, where the Italian composers Luciano Berio and Bruno Maderna founded Europe's third electronic music facility. In London in 1958, the BBC launched its radiophonic workshop, which began to develop atmospheric music for radio and television, such as the Doctor Who theme, written by the Australian composer Ron Grainer and realized by Delia Derbyshire. Important works by Varèse and the Greek Yannis Xenakis were created in European studios at this time. In 1977, the Institut de Recherche et Coordination Acoustique Musique opened in Paris. Boulez was its head, and such figures as Berio and the French-Slovenian composer and trombonist Vinko Globuker were among its staff. Since then, many composers have experimented and realized compositions at IRCAM using electronics and latterly computers. The organization has remained influential in making such techniques part of classical composition today. Major figures to develop work there include Jonathan Harvey, Harrison Birtwistle, George Benjamin, Kaya Sariaho, Un Suk Chin, Gerard Gracie, and Tristan Muriel. Gesang der Jungling. Karlheinz Stockhausen's Gesang der Jungling was created in the studios of West German Radio between 1955 and 1956. Its text comes from the biblical book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar had the Hebrew youths Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego cast into a fiery furnace for refusing to worship his image. Remaining miraculously unharmed, they sang God's praise from the flames. Some regard the work as the first masterpiece created using the sound techniques developed from the experiments of Schaeffer and Henry. It also reflects the strong spiritual basis that Stockhausen's work almost always possessed. Using electronically generated tones and pulses, filtered white noise, and the voice of 12-year-old choirboy Joseph Prochka, Stockhausen created a fiery whirlwind of rich and complex textures, operating at different speeds and dynamic levels, and utilizing the space around the audience via 4-channel sound. The result is a virtuoso creation that maintains a consistent momentum due to its perfectly planned overall structure. See also, Ionization Quartet for the End of Time for 33 Gruppen Pithepractis Sinfonia. The biblical tale of Hebrew youths surviving in a furnace, depicted here on a Bible study card, was a potent inspiration for Stockhausen. In context. Focus. Indeterminacy, aleatory music, and silence before. 1787 Mozart is thought to write instructions for the composition of as many waltzes as one desires with 2 dice, without understanding anything about music or composition. 1915 Marcel Duchamp composes Irata Musicale for 3 voices, written by drawing cards out of a hat. After 1967 Cornelius Cardew completes Treatise, a large graphic score with no musical parameters. 1983 Morton Feldman completes String Quartet No. 2, his longest work exploring the slow unfolding of music. For centuries, indeterminacy has been a compositional feature of classical music, from Baroque works with a figured bass that trusts the keyboard player to fill in the harmony in a manner not stipulated by the composer, to the musical dice games that were popular in the 18th century, in which players threw dice to decide on the order of a series of musical ideas given by a composer. A version of the game attributed to Mozart, for example, has the possibility of creating as many as 45,949,729,863,572,161 waltzes. In the 20th century, avant-garde composers pushed the concept further, and the term aleatory music was coined to describe compositions in which chance plays a significant role. Early on, Dadaists, an avant-garde art movement, saw that chance could form a part of a new aesthetic. French-American artist Marcel Duchamp composed 2 aleatory works between 1913 and 1915, while Frenchmen Francis Picabia and Georges Ribe-Montesins wrote works for performance at the Festival Dada in Paris in 1920. Cage's experiments in sound led to his invention of the prepared piano, in which the piano has its sound altered by the placement of objects on or between the strings. The composer's role. Although aleatory music originated in pure experimentalism, it was considered a serious concept by the mid-20th century, a reaction to what had gone before. Ever since composers had moved from figured bass to full notation, performers had gradually lost a sense of being actively creative musicians, and as improvised ornamentation fell by the wayside, and scores became more detailed, there had been a view, espoused by Stravinsky, that even interpretation was unnecessary. The performer's only concern, it claimed, was to reproduce the score without interference. This attitude reached its apogee with the advent of integral, or total, serialism, in which virtually all the musical parameters were controlled by the compositional system. Cage the Anarchist. For the American composer John Cage, this imbalance of power toward the composer created a musical hierarchy in opposition to his socialist and anarchist beliefs. The only way this hierarchy could be undermined, he thought, was if either the composer were less or the performer more a part of the compositional process. This concept is particularly evident in Cage's imaginary landscape No. 4 for 12 radios, in which the performers manipulate shortwave radios and so require no proficiency in an instrument. Cage remains the composer, as the various frequencies that the operators must find are detailed in the score, but the sounds received by the radios depend on when and where the concert takes place and are therefore unpredictable. The result is white noise interrupted by snatches of speech and music. If you develop an ear for sounds that are musical, it is like developing an ego. You begin to refuse sounds that are not musical and that way cut yourself off from a good deal of experience. John Cage. John Cage. Born in Los Angeles in 1912, John Cage studied music under Arnold Schoenberg and Henry Cowell and used serial techniques in his early works. By 1939, he had started to experiment with the prepared piano, tape recorders, and other technology. His concert at the New York Museum of Modern Art in 1943 brought him to the attention of a wider musical community. In the years that followed, Cage explored Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies and became fixated on the nature of music and its absence. His compositions brought fame and infamy. Although he never fully abandoned notated scores, his experimentalism led to him becoming an icon of the Fluxus movement, espousing found sound and materials. Plagued by poor health, Cage suffered a fatal stroke in 1992 at the age of 80. Other key works: 1946, 1948 Sonatas and Interludes, 1958 Concert for Piano and Orchestra, 1974, 1975 Etudes Australes, 1987 Europras 1 and 2. Musical Silence. Cage's seminal work, 433, in which the performers sit in silence for the duration, was inspired by the idea of silence as a part of music. Musicians had long used silence in music. Beethoven is reputed to have said that the music was in the silences, but for Cage this was an engagement with the Japanese idea of ma, which examines the human perception and experience of the space between things as a focus in its own right. Cage became fascinated by the idea of silence and went to Harvard University to experience its anechoic chamber, in which all sound is absorbed. Cage was shocked to find that even there, he could still hear two sounds, one high, one low, which turned out to be the sounds of his own body. In 433, Cage sought to portray his realization that even in musical silences, there was no true silence. While audiences new to 433 tend to think the work is absurd, the experience of hearing the ambient noises of the concert hall against which music is usually played is an enlightening one. Curiously, the duration of the work, roughly the length of the 78 RPM record, was a direct challenge to the commodification of music, particularly pop music, which was a neatly packaged predictable product. In publishing the score, and in saying that the piece may be performed by any instrumentalist, Cage is still allied to the classical tradition. An anechoic chamber in Bell Laboratories, New Jersey, in the 1950s, is lined with wedge-shaped pieces of fiberglass, which was commonly used in such chambers to absorb echoes. The first question I ask myself when something doesn't seem to be beautiful is, why do I think it's not beautiful? And very shortly you discover that there is no reason. John Cage. Defining music. The first performance of 433 in 1952 opened the doors to further speculation and experimentalism into what actually constitutes music. An extreme example was written by one of Cage's students, La Monte Young, whose 1960 piano piece for David Tudor No. 1 gives only the following instructions: bring a bale of hay and a bucket of water onto the stage for the piano to eat and drink. The performer may then feed the piano or leave it to eat by itself. If the former, the piece is over after the piano has been fed. If the latter, it is over after the piano eats or decides not to. Equally challenging to musical orthodoxy were some of American composer Morton Feldman's works, which sought to redefine the act of listening by unfolding music very slowly on a very large scale. Some listeners used to classical works, which averaged 25 to 30 minutes, were dismayed by his second-string quartet, which lasts some 5 hours in performance and defies conventional development. In music on such a scale, which is seldom loud and never fast, and where changes are subtle, each sound takes on its own meaning. Graphic scores. Composers also sought to create notation that might empower rather than enslave the performer. In his notation for projections and intersections, Feldman allowed the players to choose pitches and rhythms themselves. The most important new form of notation was the graphic score. This generally presented very few parameters for the performers and instead proffered a visual provocation against which they could create music. Some of these were a set of visual instructions defining the broad shape of the music, such as Cage's aria, but others presented complex and subtle imagery that bore little relation to a performable sound. The preeminent example of a graphic musical score was British composer Cornelius Carter's treatise, a 193-page graphic score that allows total interpretative freedom but expects the performers to decide on the meaning of certain features in the score beforehand. Indeed, as traditions of performance began to coalesce, graphic scores were seldom used as inspirations for improvisation but as a way for performer and composer to have equal responsibility for the work. Music of changes. In 1951, Cage was given a copy of the I Ching by the American composer Christian Wolff. Also known as the Book of Changes, this ancient Chinese text used for divination inspired the title of Cage's Music of Changes and came to inform much of its content. Enthralled by the concept of chance music, Cage wrote the piece by making charts that, when used in conjunction with the I Ching, generated pitches, note durations, dynamics, tempi, silences, and even determined how many layers of sound would be used. The resulting rhythms were too complex to notate. Cage therefore used proportional notation, in which the distance between notes on the page determined how long they were. In addition to this, Some parts of the composition were to be played on the piano strings directly, and the pianist used beaters to create percussive sounds on the piano's exterior. The result was a piece for solo piano in 4 books, which posed demanding challenges for David Tudor, Cage's customary pianist. Every something is an echo of nothing. John Cage. See also, Pierrot Lunaire Parade Gruppen and C6 Pianos Einstein on the Beach. In context. Focus total serialism before. 1948 in Paris, Pierre Schaeffer gives concerts of musique concrète, featuring pre-recorded sounds electronically altered and manipulated. 1950-1951 Number 1 for 2 pianos and Number 2 for 13 instruments by Karel Govaerts pioneered the technique of total serialism. After 1970 Mantra, for 2 pianos and electronics, begins Stockhausen's preoccupation with melodic line formulae. 1980 Stockhausen finishes Donnerstag, the first of his Licht cycle of operas. The operas are composed using the serial technique of superformulae. In 1955, Westdeutscher Rundfunk commissioned a new work from the German composer Karlheinz Stockhausen. That August, he rented a room in Paspels, eastern Switzerland, and planned a large and ambitious new piece. Although he initially aimed to write an electronic piece, he abandoned this idea in favor of conventional instrumentation, eventually conceiving a large-scale work for 3 orchestras playing simultaneously. Titled Gruppen, it became well known, both for the way it developed compositional technique and for its huge orchestral soundscape. Repetition is based on body rhythms, so we identify with the heartbeat, or with walking, or with breathing. Karlheinz Stockhausen. Structure and space. The key compositional technique of Gruppen lies in its structure. In the 1920s, composers such as Arnold Schoenberg had devised a way of writing music based on set rows of 12 pitches. Later composers, such as Pierre Boulez and Stockhausen, took this technique further, using series or groups of notes that determined not only pitch but also musical elements such as the note's volume and duration, a method often known as total serialism. The title of Gruppen refers to this technique, as the work is based on 174 formulae. Yet this was not the only influence on its structure. The contours of the mountains that Stockhausen saw from his window in Switzerland inspired his organizational diagrams for the piece. Stockhausen scored the work for 3 orchestras, each with its own conductor and playing at a different tempo, thereby transforming the usual conception of musical time. The orchestras are arranged in a horseshoe shape, with one in front of the audience, one to its left, and one to its right. A huge variety of sounds comes from these 3 locations: delicate high woodwind, passages of plucked strings, and powerful assaults from the brass. The 3-orchestra format also allows the composer to use musical space dramatically, with the focus of the audience's interest passing from one orchestra to another. Material played by one ensemble can be picked up by another or tossed around between all 3. Deviations from form. The most dramatic moments in Gruppen occur when Stockhausen disregards the rigorous rules of total serialism. 3 passages in particular abandon serial control of tempo and range of notes in order to produce musical climaxes, one highlighting violin solos by the 3 orchestral leaders, another involving percussive or plucked sounds that bounce from one orchestra to another, and a third, near the end of the work, featuring prominent brass chords and a piano cadenza. Despite these deviations, Stockhausen became known for his formulaic composition, as well as his experiments with spatialization, which culminated in his Helicopter String Quartet. Whenever I felt happy about having discovered something, the first encounter with other musicians, with specialists, etc., was that they rejected it. Karlheinz Stockhausen. The BBC Symphony Orchestra performs Gruppen for 3 orchestras on a designated Stockhausen Day at the BBC Proms in 2008, with Martin Brabants, David Robertson, and Pascal Roffey conducting. Karlheinz Stockhausen. Stockhausen was born in the Cologne region of Germany in 1928 and studied at Cologne University of Music. He later took lessons in Paris with Olivier Messiaen, whose serial compositional technique impressed him, and with Pierre Schaeffer, from whom he learned about musique concrète. In 1953, he began working at the electronic music studio of WDR. This led to wide-ranging works, from Gruppen to electronic works such as Contact. His last great work before his death in 2007 was Licht, a cycle of 7 operas. See also, Piero Lunaire Webern's Symphonie, Op. 21 Quartet for the End of Time Symphonie pour un seul. In context. Focus. Music and mathematics before 1742, 1750 J.S. Bach writes The Art of Fugue comprising 14 fugues and 4 canons. 1912 Arnold Schoenberg writes the hyperstructured Piero Lunaire. 1933 Ionization by Edgar Varese is premiered in New York. Xenakis greatly admired Varese's originality. 1936 Bela Bartok composes music for strings, percussion, and celesta, incorporating symmetrical design. 1950-1952 Pierre Boulez extends the scope of Schoenberg's 12-tone method by creating serial music. After 1960 Christoph Penderecki creates blocks of sound in Threnody for the victims of Hiroshima. It was Olivier Messiaen who suggested that Iannis Xenakis should apply mathematical and engineering principles to musical composition. Xenakis, who had studied engineering, was working in Paris for the avant-garde designer and architect Le Corbusier after fleeing the anti-communist regime in post-war Greece. Scientific basis. Pithepracta, an early work whose title comes from the Greek for actions through probabilities, is typical of Xenakis' technique, which he called stochastic, a term relating to probability. Scored for 46 stringed instruments, 2 trombones, a xylophone, and a wood block, the work was inspired by the scientific theory that a gas's temperature derives from the movement of its molecules through space. Compiling a sequence of imaginary temperatures and pressures, Xenakis translated the theory to stringed instruments moving through their pitch ranges, using a series of glissandi for each instrument. Punctuated by the wood block, trombones, and xylophone, the effect is of a seething, gas-like sound mass. Outlined in his book Musiques Formelles, Xenakis' style has had a lasting impact. Among others who cite his influence, Richard Barrett, a Welsh composer who studied genetics, says the book helped him decide to become a composer. The role of the musician must be this fundamental research, to find answers to phenomena we don't understand. Iannis Xenakis. See also, Piero Lunaire Quartet for the End of Time Gruppen Threnody for the victims of Hiroshima. In context. Focus. Ballet in Soviet Russia before 1921 Mikhail Nessin, who later taught Khachaturian, writes the opera Abraham's Youth, one of several works on Jewish themes. 1927 Backed by the Kremlin, The Red Poppy, a ballet with music by Reinhold Glier, premieres at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. 1940 Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet is widely regarded as the greatest ballet written during the Soviet period. After 1976 Armenian composer Edgar Hovhannisyan bases his opera ballet Sasunsi David on a 9th-century Armenian epic poem. The ballet Spartacus, known best in its revised 1968 version, is a spectacle on a grand scale. Unlike most ballets, its theme is not romantic but heroic, a slave rebellion led by Spartacus against his Roman masters. The ballet won Khachaturian a Lenin Prize in the year of its composition. The Soviet regime felt it symbolized the Russian people's victory against Tsarist oppressors. Others, however, now see it as referencing Soviet repression. In 1948, together with Prokofiev and Shostakovich, Khachaturian had been denounced for bourgeois anti-democratic music, but he had regained official favor, especially after Stalin's death in 1953. Childhood influences. Khachaturian had grown up in Georgia, steeped in the folk music of Armenia and the Caucasian region. The melodies and harmonic inflections of the composer's childhood, along with his commitment to close communion with ordinary people and their music, were key inspirations in his music. The hauntingly exultant adagio of Spartacus and Phrygia, from Spartacus, and the saber dance from the ballet Gayane have been widely used in television and film. The full 1968 version of Spartacus remains a staple of Russian ballet repertoire. Aram Khachaturian, photographed in later years at the height of his fame, won worldwide acclaim for his highly popular ballets, Spartacus and Gayane. See also, The Nutcracker Romeo and Juliet Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. In context. Focus. Music behind the Iron Curtain before 1946. Stalin appointed Andrei Zhdanov imposes a policy of socialist realism, championing conventional music in Eastern Europe and shunning avant-garde compositions. 1958. Russian composers such as Edison Denisov and Sofia Gabidulina begin to emulate Western experimental music and are dubbed dissidents by the authorities. After 1961. Hungarian-born, Austrian resident György Ligeti composes atmospheres for orchestra, with its sliding and combining note clusters. 1970. Witold Lutoslawski's Cello Concerto is premiered, bringing him international success in the wake of social unrest in his native Poland. For many contemporary listeners, Polish composer Krzysztof Penderecki's 1960 piece Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima signaled an innovative new phase of music in communist Eastern Europe. Until then, much of the region's music had adhered to a traditional, socialist realist style. In Penderecki's Threnody, however, audiences were exposed to an unprecedented soundscape of strings, wails, and whispers. It is scored for a string orchestra of 52 players, each one with their own individual line and with the string sections also divided into groups. The 24 violins, for example, are split into 4 groups of 6 each, to experiment with locations of sound. As the piece begins, these 4 groups all play a note cluster near the top of their registers. From there, and throughout the piece, the group members play at different pitches just a quarter step apart from each other in clusters of notes, causing a sense of unease that permeates the piece. The cenotaph in Hiroshima's Peace Park, Japan, commemorates those who lost their lives in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, from which Threnody takes its title. A profoundly disturbing piece of apparently hopeless cataclysmic atmosphere and a highly individual technique of composition. Carl H. Warner. Author. Playing with technique. The Threnody is not structured conventionally but around blocks of sound, some of them based on the opening note cluster, others on thinner textures, instrumental lines, or other material. Much of the piece sounds striking because of Penderecki's instructions that players produce unusual timbres by means of irregular techniques. These include bowing the strings on the bridge of the instrument, along the fingerboard, or between the bridge and the tailpiece, or hitting the body of the instrument with the bow, or their fingers. The result is a composition quite unlike any of its time. Penderecki conceived of the work as abstract music and planned to call it 8 feet 37 inches, in reference to its length. However, even though the work had not been inspired by the detonation of the atomic bomb, he retitled the work Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima to increase the piece's emotional impact before entering it for a UNESCO prize in composition. Penderecki also devised a unique, graphic way of notating his music. Instead of bar lines, the composer gave timings in seconds at regular points in the score to denote tempo. Blocks of quarter steps are shown on the score as horizontal bands. Penderecki also created additional symbols, such as a note stem that instructs the player to bend the pitch up or down a quarter step and wavering lines indicating a pitch-bending vibrato. Threnody made Penderecki's name and influenced other Eastern European composers, such as Henryk Górecki and Kazimierz Siraki in Poland, and the Hungarian György Ligeti, to explore new sounds and textures and ways of writing music based on blocks of sound. This was not really political music, but it was music that was totally appropriate to the time during which we were living. Krzysztof Penderecki. Krzysztof Penderecki. Born in Byka, Poland, in 1933, Krzysztof Penderecki was educated at the Krakow Academy of Music. Within 2 years of graduating in 1958, he became well known for Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima. Many of his subsequent pieces also employed unconventional instrumentation, such as the typewriter and musical saw. Still more popular was Penderecki's St. Luke Passion, which combined unusual textures with a traditional form and Christian theme. In the 1970s, Penderecki became a professor at the Yale School of Music. His output returned to a more conventional musical style in pieces such as his Symphony No. 2. With a catalog of works in various forms, Penderecki, who is still composing music, is widely regarded as Poland's greatest living composer. Other key works: 1960 Anaclasis, for 42 strings and percussion. 1971 Utrinja. 1984 Polish Requiem. 1988, 1995 Symphony No. 3. See also, Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, Spartacus, Lutoslawski's Fourth Symphony, Ligeti's Etudes pour piano. In context. Focus minimalism before. 1893 Erik Satie composes Vexations, a piano piece that is widely recognized as being a forerunner of minimalism. 1958 La Monte Young writes his Trio for strings, considered to be the original work of musical minimalism. 1962 in Mescaline Mix, Riley develops the technique of repetitions using tape delay. After 1967 Philip Glass writes a succession of minimalist pieces, including Greatest and 1+1. 1971 The Who's song Baba O'Reilly, dedicated to Terry Riley, opens with a keyboard riff inspired by trademark minimalist repetition. In 1950s America, a generation of artists, such as Donald Judd, Richard Serra, and Frank Stella, championed a new kind of minimalist art. Inspired partly by Piet Mondrian and other artists of the Dutch to Still movement founded in 1917, it relied on plain, often industrial, materials and was free of any explicit meaning or influence. In music, too, American composers, including La Monte Young, Steve Reich, and Terry Riley, looked to strip notation, instrumentation, and rhythm to their barest essentials. To this they added a new set of materials, including sound samples recorded on magnetic tape and played on a repeated loop. In C is revolutionary. It introduces repetition as a primary constructive force into Western music. Robert Davidson, composer and student of Riley. Breaking new ground. In C was the work in which Terry Riley defined the musical style that became known as minimalism. It features a steady pulse, gradual transformation, and the repetition of short phrases or musical cells, focusing the attention not on a goal toward which the music is progressing, but on a continuous process of change. Riley did not begin with the aim of writing a minimalist piece. In C emerged partly from his experimentation with tape loops, particularly when he collaborated with trumpeter Chet Baker on the music for a theater production called The Gift, in Paris in 1963. He recorded Baker and his musicians then made loops from the tapes and played them back simultaneously but starting at different times so they repeated out of sync. In C uses a similar technique but with live players rather than tapes. The piece consists of 53 musical phases of varying length that can be played by any number of instruments and ensembles of any size, although Riley prefers a group of between 25 and 30 musicians. The performers play the phrases in a set order but can repeat each phrase as many times as they like, creating a piece that can vary in length from 20 minutes to several hours. The musicians also start the phrases at different times, so they are not always synchronized. The work is anchored by a rhythmic pulse provided by one musician who repeats the C note throughout, acting as a kind of metronome. This is usually played on the piano or a percussion instrument, such as a marimba. A lasting presence. Although In C has been called the first truly minimalist work, it followed a number of earlier experiments from the late 1950s and displays major differences from many other works in the genre. In most minimalist pieces, the composer typically controls the material much more tightly than Riley, who leaves crucial decisions, such as the instrumentation and the number of repetitions, to the performers. This is known as aleatory, or chance-driven, music. Riley has rejected the minimalist label and resisted being limited by any kind of ism. In spite of this, his work has been hugely influential on composers such as Michael Nyman and Gavin Bryars in Britain, American Steve Reich and Philip Glass, and the Estonian Arvo Pärt, who have all embraced elements of minimalism in their work. Riley's hypnotic musical approach also influenced the rise of ambient music in the 1970s. Seated at his keyboard, Terry Riley accompanies the Lahore-born musician Pandit Pran Nath, one of his earliest mentors, in a concert at Le Palace Theatre, Paris, in 1972. Terry Riley. Born in California in 1935, Terry Riley met La Monte Young, with whom he was to forge a new and radical approach to music while studying composition at the University of California. In the 1960s, as well as pioneering the use of tape loops, Riley embraced electronic overdubbing, especially on the album A Rainbow in Curved Air, on which he played all the instrumental parts himself, a major influence on Mike Oldfield's similarly virtuosic album Tubular Bells. In the 1970s, Riley studied Indian classical music, which he has continued to combine with his interest in avant-garde Western music and jazz. In the same decade, Riley began a long-lasting collaboration with the Kronos Quartet, producing many works, including Sun Rings, which features sounds gathered from space. 1969 A Rainbow in Curved Air 1971, 1972 Persian Surgery Dervishes 1989 Salome Dances for Peace 2002 Sun Rings. See also, 433 6 pianos Einstein on the Beach. In context. Focus East meets West. Before 1903 inspired by East Asia and the European trend of exoticism, Claude Debussy mimicked Chinese and Japanese melodies in pagodas, the first movement of his estamps. After 1991 in his quotation A Dream, subtitled Say See, Take Me, from a poem by Emily Dickinson, Takemitsu quotes Debussy's La Mer. 1998 Chinese-American composer Tan Dun dedicates his Water Concerto for water percussion and orchestra to the memory of Takemitsu. Takemitsu composed November Steps in his secluded private cottage on Mount Asama in central Honshu, Japan's main island. The only materials he had with him were Debussy's original manuscript piano scores of Prelude à l'après-midi d'un faun and Ju, with their multicolored notation and handwritten commentaries. In November Steps, Takemitsu employs traditional Japanese instruments, the shakuhachi and biwa. His aim in this piece was not to blend their sounds into the Western orchestra but to contrast their timbre with those of a Western ensemble. He succeeded in reviving the essential nature of the Japanese instruments, creating a striking intensity against the orchestra's sound stream, couched in a unique tone language. The traditional biwa, used in November Steps, is played here in 2007 in New York by Junko Tahara to music by Joji Uasa, an early member of Takemitsu's experimental workshop. A Cosmic World of Music. Takemitsu was first exposed to Western classical music, represented by such figures as Debussy, Alban Berg, and Olivier Messiaen, during military service in World War II. He would later create his own cosmic world of music that infused these influences with Eastern and Japanese sensitivity. Inspired by Debussy's rare intuition, Takemitsu came to recognize the light and shade of sound and what he called a density of tones. From Messiaen, Takemitsu learned the conception of the form and color of time, as he put it, and in fact wrote his piano piece Rain Trees Sketch 2 in memory of the composer. Unlike Messiaen, Takemitsu did not belong to a particular religion but considered himself a religious person. The act of composing was for him a prayer. He likened it to taking out a part of an eternal river of sound running through the world surrounding us. Like his close friend John Cage, who was fascinated with fungi, and Messiaen, a passionate bird lover, Takemitsu related deeply to the natural world. As the titles of many of his works indicate, he felt his music was intimately linked to both nature and the universe. I am a gardener of time. I want to create a garden connecting to infinite time. Toru Takemitsu. Silence and Sound. Takemitsu had a profound interest in the relationship between silence and sound. The Eastern concept of ma, an intense silence between sounds, was for him contrary to the Western idea of a musical rest, literally, a resting silence. In the East, too, according to Takemitsu, one tone of the shakuhachi can become hotoke. That is, a single tone can embody cosmic nature. In the West, by contrast, tones are joined together into melodies, rhythms, and harmonies. Takemitsu never used conventional Western musical forms. Most of his works are short, reflecting characteristics of Japanese literature, such as haiku poetry. Colorful sonorities are one hallmark of Takemitsu's music. As the Western orchestra possesses perhaps the greatest capacity to create different tone colors, it is no coincidence that he wrote a large number of orchestral works. Takemitsu also devised unique compositional techniques, later adopted by younger Japanese composers. In the piano piece Les Clauses, he created layers of simultaneous melodies with slightly different note values so that each note makes a tiny anticipation or delay, erasing the sense of beats and creating a fluid-like texture. Takemitsu's music is wholly original, a unique juxtaposition of Japanese and Western musical traditions. A Western tone walks horizontally, but a tone of the shakuhachi rises vertically like a tree. Toru Takemitsu. Toru Takemitsu. Born in Tokyo, Japan, in 1930, Takemitsu briefly studied composition with Yasuji Kiyose in 1948 but was essentially self-taught. In 1951, he organized the experimental workshop Jiken Kobo with the poet Shuzo Takiguchi and others pursuing avant-garde methods. Takemitsu's Requiem for Strings, written after the death of composer Fumio Hayasaka, whom he adored, was praised by Stravinsky. A decade later, the success of November Steps established his international reputation as the leading Japanese composer. From the 1970s, he used fewer Japanese instruments in his works, preferring conventional Western instruments and more tonal sonorities, as in pieces such as A String Around Autumn. He composed a large number of works with Western idioms and wrote music for more than 90 Japanese films. Takemitsu died in Tokyo in 1996. Other key works: 1957 Requiem for Strings, 1979, and An Autumn Garden, 1994 Archipelago S. See also, Das Lied von der Erde Prelude à l'après-midi d'un Faun Quartet for the End of Time 433. In context. Focus. Quotation and collage. Before 1906, American composer Charles Ives writes Central Park in the Dark, an early example of musical collage. 1952, Imaginary Landscape No. 5 by John Cage creates an unpredictable collage using 42 records as its source materials. After 1977, Alfred Schnittke composes his Concerto Grosso No. 1 in an example of the collage technique that he called polystylism. 1981, The Adventures of Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel showcases the virtuoso DJ mixing techniques that were a foundation of early hip-hop. The 1960s, a decade of profound social change, reached its height in 1968, the year in which Luciano Berio's Sinfonia had its first performance. These changes, the civil rights movement, student protests, new mass media channels, and the clash of high art and popular culture, were happening on streets and in homes around the world, and all made their way into Italian composer Luciano Berio's dismantling and reconstruction of classical music history. Sinfonia, the title of which is a deliberate allusion to the old-fashioned symphony genre, established Berio as one of the most inventive composers of his generation. Commissioned by Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, it is best known for its extraordinary third movement, which consists of a whirl of musical quotations from Bach to Pierre Boulez. Running throughout its 12 minutes is the largest quotation of all, the dancing, spinning scherzo from Mahler's Symphony No. 2, Resurrection. The Swingle Singers perform in 1965, typically with only drums and double bass as accompaniment. The French group made jazzy covers of both popular and classical pieces. The quotation technique. Composers had used quotation and even collage techniques before, as early as 1906, and before artists such as Picasso and Braque had painted visual collages in the early 1910s, Charles Ives had layered different melodies and musical styles in Central Park in the Dark. More recently, John Cage had begun experimenting with playing records and differently tuned radios simultaneously. In a way, quotation had been a part of classical music since the masters of organum used Gregorian chants to make their polyphonic church music in the 12th century. However, Sinfonia was the first time quotation had been used to such an extent. It was a whole movement for full orchestra, created almost entirely from borrowed materials. On top of all of this are the vocal lines. 8 singers perform from a text in which passages from Samuel Beckett's The Unnamable are mixed with extracts from James Joyce, Paul Valery, musical directions, and slogans from the Paris protests. In order for the singers to be heard, their voices needed to be amplified, and Berriot turned to the Swingle Singers, a popular group in their day, because of their familiarity with microphone technique. Sinfonia is a 5-part meditation on the past and the future. The first part was originally intended to stand alone. O King, the work's second movement, was written in 1967 as a tribute to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. After King's assassination in April 1968, Berriot decided to incorporate it into Sinfonia, expanding that into a work for 4 singers and full orchestra and serving now as a memorial to the civil rights leader. Its text simply repeats King's name, separated into phonemes and stretched across wide intervals of time, as though evaporating into the air. Other influences. Sinfonia's fourth movement is also a lament, in which Berriot mourns all of the lost heroes and ideas of movements 2 and 3. Unlike these, the first movement is a study in Brazilian origin myths, drawing on text extracted from Claude Lévi-Strauss's revolutionary and recently published study in mythology, The Raw and the Cooked. The fifth and final movement, which Berriot added only after the work's premiere, synthesizes and reflects upon the previous 4. Using Mahler was a tribute to Leonard Bernstein, who has done so much for his music. Luciano Berio. Luciano Berio. Berio was born in the town of Oneglia, Italy, in 1924. His father and grandfather, who were both organists, taught him to play the piano. After World War II, he went to study at the Milan Conservatory, but an injury to his hand forced him to give up piano studies for composition. He married the American singer and composer Kathy Berberian in 1950, writing several works for her before their divorce in 1964. Berriot's interest in the avant-garde movement began in the 1950s, and he became Italy's leading composer in the genre. In 1955, he established an electronic studio in Milan, one of the world's first, with Bruno Maderna. Berriot was also a respected teacher of composition, particularly at the Juilliard School in New York. His pupils included Steve Reich and Grateful Dead guitarist Phil Lesh. Berriot died in Rome in 2003. Other key works: 1958 Thema, 1966 Sequenza 3, 1977 Coro. See also, Magnus Liber Organi Ives Symphony No. 4 Symphonie pour un seul Gruppen. In context. Focus. Theater and radicalism in English music before 1912 Arnold Schoenberg's song-cycle melodrama Pierrot Lunaire launches the concept of the avant-garde. 1968 The ritualistic violence of Harrison Birtwhistle's opera Punch and Judy disconcerts listeners at the UK's Aldeburgh Festival, including its founder, Benjamin Britten. After 1972 Maxwell Davies's opera Taverner, an ambitiously dramatic portrait of the Tudor composer John Taverner, is first performed at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. 1986 Birtwhistle's lyric tragedy The Mask of Orpheus, a theatrical representation on an immense scale of multiple versions of the Orpheus legend, premieres in London. With some exceptions, such as the areas of psychology and imagination explored in the operas of Benjamin Britten and Michael Tippett, British classical music after World War II was generally enthralled to convention. Prominent new works, such as Sinfonia Antarctica by Ralph Vaughan Williams, or William Walton's Cello Concerto, were seen as looking back to a traditional past rather than pointing toward an exciting new future. As the 1960s arrived, however, with their release of long pent-up desires for social and political change, a similar revolution in classical music was about to erupt. The ratings of the mentally afflicted George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland, provided the disconcerting basis for the libretto of 8 songs for a Mad King. New Blood. When Peter Maxwell Davies entered the Royal Manchester College of Music in 1952, he found a number of like-minded radical fellow students, composers Harrison Birtwistle and Alexander Gore, trumpeter and conductor Elgar Howarth, and pianist John Ogden. This new Manchester school was an informal group of very different artistic personalities. While Gore's music related to the modern Austro-German tradition of the interwar years, with its roots in the style and technical method of Arnold Schoenberg, Birtwistle looked to reconnect with ancient theatrical ritual, particularly Greek theater. Davies meanwhile rebelled against conventional teaching methods in the quest for a modern composing idiom developed from the musical techniques and structures of Renaissance Europe. Music theater. In the 1960s, the avant-garde genre of music theater provided Davies with a vehicle for his modernist style. In music theater, musicians shared the stage with vocal and theatrical performers, all taking part equally in the drama. The idea had its origins in Schoenberg's groundbreaking atonal work Pierrot Lunaire, with its new kind of part-singing, part-spoken vocal performance and strong theatrical elements. In 1967, Davies and Birtwistle founded a chamber group to perform Pierrot Lunaire and more contemporary pieces. It was called the Pierrot Players, after the Schoenberg work, and in 1970 reformed as the Fires of London. The group set out to stage provocatively subversive dramatic works in small venues. Among these was 8 Songs for a Mad King, portraying the unhinged psychological world of the British monarch King George III. Some of the group's players were deployed on stage in cages to represent the caged birds that the king liked to talk to. Alongside the traditional instruments used, such as violin, cello, and clarinet, were unusual examples, including a railway whistle, steel bar, didgeridoo, and toy bird calls. The vocal part, written for the South African baritone Roy Hart, exploited an extraordinary range of sounds, from singing to screaming and screeching, extremely high or low notes, and even simultaneous notes sung together in chords. Fusion sounds. Although the work was a huge success, Davies soon moved away from composing purely avant-garde pieces. From 1972, he turned his attention to classical forms and went on to write 10 orchestral symphonies, many of which were inspired by his new home of Orkney, Scotland. Over the course of his career, Davies gained a reputation for polystylism, combining disparate genres in one piece. By the turn of the 21st century, classical music in Britain had similarly moved far beyond the dominance of any one set of stylistic values. The music of Jonathan Harvey mastered the fusion of vocal, instrumental, and electronic sounds, whereas John Tavener successfully absorbed the music of Eastern Orthodox Christianity into the Western concert hall. The music of Mark Anthony Turnage, meanwhile, has boldly incorporated elements of jazz into classical pieces. Sometimes I suspect that Davies himself may be a little bit mad. Peter G. Davis. Music critic. Peter Maxwell Davies. Born in Salford, Lancashire, in 1934, Davies won a place at the Royal Manchester College of Music. After further study in Italy, he taught music at Cirencester Grammar School, starting a lifelong commitment to musical education. After spells studying and teaching in the US and Australia, he returned to England in 1966, where he gained a reputation as a controversial figure in contemporary music. A visit to the Orkney Islands in Scotland in 1970 began a deep involvement with the islands and their culture. He settled on Hoy in 1974, later moving to another island, Sandy. In 1976, he founded the Street Magnus International Festival, named after Orkney's patron saint, involving local people alongside professional musicians. Davies was master of the Queen's music from 2004 until his death in 2016. Other key works: 1960 O Magnum Mysterium, 1962, 1970 Taverner, 1969 World's Bliss, 1976, 1977 The Martyrdom of Street Magnus. See also Pierrot Lunaire, A Child of Our Time, Peter Grimes in 7 Days. In context. Focus: Late minimalism. Before 1958, American composer La Monte Young completes his pioneering minimalist work, Trio for Strings. 1964 Terry Riley's In C is an influential minimalist work. It uses simple musical fragments to create a wave-like sound. After 1978 Brian Eno's Ambient 1, Music for Airports introduces minimalism into popular music, helping to create the new genre of ambient music. 1982 Minimalism and medieval Gregorian chant influenced the Estonian Arvo Part in works such as his St. John Passion. First performed in New York in 1973, Reich's six pianos employs the phasing technique the American composer had developed in the 1960s. The six pianists play the same repeated 8-beat rhythmic pattern, but each strikes different notes. The repeated pattern produces richly textured, shifting waves of sound as the pianists move in and out of phase with each other. Rhythm and repetition. Reich was an early adherent of the minimalist style that began to emerge in the United States in the late 1950s. Pioneered by La Monte Young and Terry Riley, soon joined by Philip Glass and Reich, it was a reaction against the serialism of European composers such as Arnold Schoenberg and Pierre Boulez. In contrast to melodies and harmonies based on the 12-tone chromatic scale, minimalism used repeated chords or sequences that changed only by tiny increments over the course of a piece. It was also marked by strong rhythms. Although his style was initially controversial, by 1976 Reich's music for 18 musicians was well received. In the 1980s, he moved away from strict minimalism, developing richer harmonies and melodies. Notable later works by Reich, whose style has influenced both classical and popular music, include Different Trains in the Cave, a multimedia opera created with his wife, the video artist Beryl Corot. Reel-to-reel tapes and other recording equipment enabled Reich, shown here in 1982, to perfect the phasing techniques that he would then apply to live instruments. See also, Pierrot Lunaire grew up in Trinity for the victims of Hiroshima and see Einstein on the Beach. In context. Focus. Minimalism in opera before 1954 Glass visits Paris and sees films by Jean Cocteau that later become the basis for his operas, Orphée, La Belle et la Bête, and Les Enfants Terribles. 1965 In an early involvement with avant-garde theater, Glass writes music for Samuel Beckett's one-act play. After 1977 David Bowie's albums Low and Heroes, created with Brian Eno, will later inspire Glass's Symphonies No. 1 and No. 4. 1990 Glass and Indian musician Ravi Shankar release Passages, an album of chamber music that they have composed together. Created in collaboration with the avant-garde theater director Robert Wilson, Philip Glass's opera Einstein on the Beach was first performed in 1976 in Avignon, France. Inspired by the life of the physicist Albert Einstein, it has no plot but works through image, dance, and music, using recurring projected images to evoke aspects of Einstein's world. There is no orchestra but only an ensemble of electronic keyboards and wind instruments. Words are sparse and incantatory. The work has no intervals and lasts 5 hours, during which the audience can come and go as they please. Powerful, hypnotic music. Einstein on the Beach was the fruit of a decade of experimenting. Glass was classically trained, but like Reich and others in the emerging minimalist movement, he rejected earlier styles. After transcribing some of Ravi Shankar's Indian sitar music and traveling in India and North Africa in the 1960s, he began to develop a style of his own based, in his words, on repetitive and cyclic structures. The result was often hypnotic, arpeggio and harmonic motifs repeated for long stretches virtually unchanged. His success with Einstein on the Beach was followed by Satyagraha, Akhenaten, and a number of other operas, film scores, symphonies, and other works. Glass influenced musicians such as David Bowie, Brian Eno, and the band Pink Floyd. Their music also influenced his own. I was in that generation of people who could look beyond the borders of Europe and North and South America. Philip Glass. See also, Gruppen in C 8 songs for a Mad King 6 pianos. In context. Focus sonic ecology. Before 1912 Mahler writes his Eighth Symphony, a bid to imagine the whole universe beginning to ring and resound. 1966 Schaeffer begins Patria, a cycle of large-scale music theater works conceived for special spaces. After 1994 The Apocalypse by John Tavener is premiered at the BBC Proms. 2003 with Sontag, Karlheinz Stockhausen completes his 7-opera cycle Licht. 2006 John Luther Adams is the place where you go to listen, a sound and light installation reflecting natural rhythms, opens in Alaska. Conceived on the grandest scale, with multiple ensembles, singers, and instrumentalists, Schaeffer's musical spectacle Apocalypsis is part of a long tradition in Western art music that extends back to Monteverdi's Vespers. An even earlier inspiration is Tallis's motet Spem in Alium, whose immersive use of 8 5-voice choirs influenced the 12 spatially arranged choirs used in the second part of Apocalypsis, Credo. Opposing sound pollution. Schaeffer, who founded the study of acoustic ecology in the 1960s, pursues ecological themes in his work, opposing the gradual masking of the natural soundscape by man-made noise. Such themes are the subject of Apocalypsis. The first part, John's vision, tells of the destruction of the world using texts from the Bible's book of Revelation and a new Antichrist's vision of good, cities, jet aircraft, computers, and the habit of energy, and evil. This vision, clearly opposed to Schaeffer's ethics, is vanquished in the second part, Credo. Here, Schaeffer adapts 12 meditations from Giordano Bruno's cosmological treatise De la Causa, Principio et Uno of 1584. Each starts, Lord God is universe, creating a cumulative, ritualistic effect. The last proclaims universe is one act, one form, one soul, one body, one being, the maximum and only, encapsulating Schaeffer's spiritual and ecological beliefs. Schaeffer's Apocalypsis is inspired by the vision in Revelation in which 4 horsemen, depicted here in a woodcut by Christoph Mura, are the harbingers of the Last Judgment. See also, Spem in Alium Monteverdi's Vespers Street Matthew Passion Elijah The Dream of Gerontius. In context. Focus. Controlled aleatory composition before. 1958 John Cage composes his concert for piano and orchestra. 1961 After hearing a snippet of Cage's concert on the radio, Lutoslawski uses controlled aleatory for the first time in his Juveniscience. After 2003 Lutoslawski's Polish colleague Wojciech Killer composes September Symphony to commemorate the 9/11 attacks in New York City. 2011 Liza Lem's Tongue of the Invisible is one of many contemporary works since Lutoslawski's death that combine controlled improvisation with passages in conventional notation. The life of Polish composer Witold Lutoslawski coincided with a turbulent period in Eastern Europe. At the time of his birth in 1913, Poland was partitioned between Austria, Prussia, and Russia. In World War II, the composer was briefly imprisoned by the Nazis, and after the war, he was hounded by the communist authorities. Only in his last years was Poland free. While Lutoslawski believed in the autonomy of art, critics often perceived the reflection of outside tensions in his music. Like many of his pieces, his Fourth Symphony, whose compositions span the fall of communism, has 2 halves, a halting introduction, followed by a decisive and conclusive statement. An element of chance. From the early 1960s, a consistent feature of his music was his use of controlled aleatory passages, in which the coordination between instrumental parts is partially governed by chance. They may be fully written out, but how they line up is only partly predictable. They may start at different times, for example. The method is evident in the Fourth Symphony's first section. At 3 points, rhythmic music dissolves into disarray, like a false start to a race, creating a sense of anticipation that is resolved in the work's more assertive second half. The Fourth Symphony was Lutoslawski's last work. He died in 1994, a year after conducting its Los Angeles premiere. It always fascinated me, and I couldn't imagine any other profession than musician, and even composer. Witold Lutoslawski. See also, Webern Symphonie, Op. 21 Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, 433 Gruppen. In context. Focus fractal music. Before 1915, Debussy's 12 etudes introduced pictorial imagery to the etudes genre. 1947, Conlon Nancarrow writes rhythmically elaborate studies for a pianola. 1959, Ligeti uses what he later called micropolyphony in his orchestral apparitions. 1984, Charles Wurinen's Bamboula Squared employs a computer-generated tape partly inspired by Benoit Mandelbrot's work on fractals. After 2003, Ligeti's student Unsuk Chin completes her own set of 12 etudes, continuing her teacher's interest in complex rhythms. The term fractal was first used in 1975 by the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, though the concept is much older. It describes images, surfaces, sounds, or other patterns made up of many versions of the whole, which they continue to resemble however tiny they are and however often subdivided. The composer Georgi Ligeti first came across fractals in 1984 in images by the mathematician Heinz Otto Peitgen. Ligeti recognized that the principle of internal symmetry had been present in his music for years. He had used a technique he called micropolyphony, overlaying multiple closely related versions of the same musical line to create dense, shimmering textures. Studies in fractal style. Ligeti began to employ ideas derived from mathematics and the broader theory of chaos. He had also become interested in Central African music, the pianola studies of Conlon Nancarrow, and the jazz piano music of Bill Evans and Thelonious Monk. To synthesize these influences, he turned to the piano study, or etude, a form used by Chopin, Liszt, and Debussy. Ligeti's 18 etudes all employ rhythmic and melodic processes that interact, conflict, and even cancel each other out. Their titles, such as Disorder and Vertigo, reflect the images their streams of notes evoke. Works of fantasy, they are a major contribution to the late 20th century repertoire. In my music one finds a unification of construction with poetic, emotional imagination. Georgi Ligeti. See also, The Art of Fugue, Chopin's Preludes, Prelude à l'après-midi d'un fond Pithepracta. In context. Focus. Opera into the 21st century. Before 1992, Peter Sellers stages Olivier Messiaen's opera Saint François d'Assise in Salzburg, Austria. Sarajevo finds it inspiring. After 2003, the opera Rasputin by Finnish composer Aino Juhani Rautavaara receives its world premiere in Helsinki. 2008, The Minotaur by Harrison Birtwistle to a libretto by poet David Harsent is premiered at the Royal Opera House in London. 2015, Jennifer Higdon's grand opera, Cold Mountain, premieres in Santa Fe, New Mexico, United States. Finnish composer Kaija Saariaho's opera, L'amour de loin, was one of the first new operas of the 21st century. The lavish production, premiered at the Salzburg Festival, Austria, renewed excitement in the genre of grand opera involving large casts and orchestras. In the late 20th century, inexpensive chamber operas had been more popular. Love from Afar. Written to a French libretto by Amin Malouf, L'amour de loin is based on a sketch of Joffre Rudel, a 12th century French troubadour, and his love for Clemence, a woman he has idealized from a distance, hence the title, meaning love from afar. The small solo cast is complemented by a chorus and sizable orchestra that features accessible, consonant harmony, with electronic elements and attention to tone color, all hallmarks of Saariaho's style. Following the opera's world premiere at the Salzburg Festival in Austria, critics praised its lyricism. Since then, it has become one of the most frequently performed operas in the 21st century, with productions in Paris, London, New York, and Toronto. The success of L'amour de loin led to renewed interest in grand opera and further commissions. Saariaho's second grand opera, Adriana Mater, followed in 2005. Kaija Saariaho works on a score in Paris, France, her home since 1982, when she first studied at IRCAM, the Acoustic Music Research Institute that strongly influenced her early style. See also, Peer Gynt the Wreckers, Peter Grimes' Einstein on the Beach. In context. Focus. Return to lyricism before 1984. The New York Philharmonic programs Horizons 84, The New Romanticism, a broader view draw mass public attention to neo-romanticism. 1991. John Corigliano's opera The Ghosts of Versailles premieres at the Metropolitan Opera, New York City. It is the company's first new opera since the 1960s. After 2009. Film composer John Williams's On Willows and Birches premieres with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. 2017. The Evolution of Steve Jobs, by Mason Bates, opens at Opera Santa Fe, New Mexico. The unifying theme of Jennifer Higdon's music is her compositional philosophy of communicating effectively. Her work Blue Cathedral achieves this through her characteristic exploration of tone color, combined with expressive lyricism. In the latter half of the 20th century, many artistic ensembles were struggling financially. Contemporary music had been associated with trends such as post-minimalism, electronic works, and experimental music that had often alienated the general public. To attract audiences, ensembles therefore chose to perform older works that entailed little risk. Higdon's Blue Cathedral, however, with its warmth, lyricism, and emotion, demonstrated that modern music could appeal to audiences of all ages and demographics, opening the door for an exciting period of new music in the 21st century. I don't think you should have to know anything about my music, or anything about music in general, to enjoy it. I look at music as a mirror. Jennifer Higdon. Love, Life, and Death. Higdon was commissioned to write Blue Cathedral to mark the 75th anniversary of the American Conservatory, the Curtis Institute of Music. Although initially conceived as a celebration, the composer was at the time mourning the death of her younger brother, Andrew Blue Higdon. Both events inform the title, Blue, in memory of her brother Andrew, to whom the score is dedicated, and Cathedral to represent Curtis as a place of learning and growth. In this tone poem, Higdon's heavenly music suggests a cathedral in the sky. It features numerous solo instruments, most prominently the flute and the clarinet, to represent the Higdon siblings who played those instruments. As Higdon is the older sibling, the flute appears first, followed by the clarinet. This duet briefly returns near the end, before the flute ceases, leading the clarinet to continue its journey alone. Additional extended solos are presented by the English horn and a violin. Both are complemented by smaller instrumental melodies that represent the lives a single person touches in his or her journey. In the introduction and coda, Higdon also experiments with the percussion section, utilizing some unorthodox orchestration, such as crystal glasses and Chinese bells, to create an ethereal atmosphere. The work premiered on May 1, 2000, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with Robert Spano as conductor. Musicians and critics lauded Higdon's ability to communicate the universal themes of love, life, and death. The work's strong lyricism, exploration of orchestral color, and programmatic content made it a great success, and it became one of the 21st century's most popular compositions, with some 600 productions performed across the world. The solo clarinet features prominently in Blue Cathedral. It was the instrument played by Higdon's brother, who died of skin cancer shortly before Higdon composed the piece. The Atlanta School. Following Blue Cathedral's premiere, Higdon began a long and fruitful association with the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra led by Spano. The conductor initiated what would become known as the Atlanta School of Composers, a group comprising Higdon, Christopher Theofanidis, Osvaldo Golajov, Michael Gundolfi, and Adam Schoenberg. Although diverse in musical style, the composers are unified by their dedication to tonality and melody, as well as their incorporation of world music and popular culture. Together, they have redefined the genre of contemporary music. Jennifer Higdon. Jennifer Higdon was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1962, and then moved with her family first to Atlanta and then to the Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. After teaching herself to play the flute at the age of 15, she began formal music studies at 18 and went on to pursue composition studies at graduate level alongside two of America's most significant composers of the 20th century, Ned Rorem and George Crumb. Higdon has received many awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in Music for her violin concerto, Grammy Awards for her percussion concerto and viola concerto, and an International Opera Award for her first opera, Cold Mountain, based on the best-selling novel of the same name by Charles Fraser. Her popularity allows her to compose exclusively on commission. 2005 The Percussion Concerto, 2008 The Singing Rooms, 2009 Violin Concerto, 2015 Cold Mountain. See also, Symphonie Fantastique Saint-Saëns Piano Concerto No. 2 in G minor Das Lied von der Erde Prelude à l'après-midi d'un von the Lark ascending Appalachian Spring. In context. Focus. Music and multimedia before. 1910 in Prometheus, the poem of fire, Alexander Scriabin calls for a color organ to fill the concert hall with colored light. 1952 John Cage's theater piece No. 1, with paintings by Robert Rauschenberg and dance by Merce Cunningham, is staged in North Carolina. 2003 Olga Neuwirth combines video, music, and theater in her adaptation of David Lynch's film Lost Highway. After 2010 Michel van der A's Up Close combines video opera and cello concerto. 2016 Everything is Important by Jennifer Walsh uses music and film to explore modern life. Visual accompaniments to music have been known for centuries, becoming ubiquitous and infinitely more varied in recent times. In British composer Thomas Ades's In 7 Days, a depiction of the biblical creation story, his collaborator Tal Rossner's video illustrates, enriches, and expands on the music, a set of variations on two themes, for piano and orchestra. Ades adds an unusual twist. His themes are not introduced at the beginning but at the end, in a short final movement, which distills the core essence from the earlier 6 movements corresponding to the 6 days described in Genesis. In this music, creation evolves from chaos into order. Images enhancing sound. In Rossner's visual accompaniment to In 7 Days, images dance and spin in time with the sounds, echoing the music's kaleidoscopic depiction of the balance between chaos and order. The video is mostly abstract, with geometrical shapes, patterns, waves, and flows, yet these are actually derived from pictures of London's Royal Festival Hall and the Los Angeles Walt Disney Concert Hall, which jointly commissioned the work. Ades and Rossner call their work a visual ballet, and when used, the video is generally projected on screens above the orchestra. The music can also be played alone, but together the two create a powerful multimedia experience. The better you play it, and the closer you come to his idiosyncratic vision, the more wonderful it sounds. Simon Rattle. See also, Ides's Symphony No. 4 Janáček's Sinfonietta Pithapracta Legides Etudes pour piano. In context. Focus. Choral music in the 21st century before. 1921 Vaughan Williams writes a pastoral symphony that helps establish the lyrical sound of the English pastoral school. 1977 Arvo Part's Missa Syllabica, Fratres, and Cantus in Memoriam Benjamin Britten introduce a new style of devotional composition. 1997 Sir John Taverner's Song for Athene, composed in 1993 as a tribute to a family friend, is performed at the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales. After 2013 Caroline Shaw wins the Pulitzer Prize for Music for her partita for 8 voices. 2014 Gabriel Jackson writes 7 Advent antiphons, one of his many liturgical settings. Eric Whitacre, one of the most popular 21st century composers, is an advocate for the uplifting power of choral music. The majority of his works are choral, including Alleluia. Though the origins of that piece are instrumental, a composition titled October evoking the colors and radiance of autumn. Inspired by the 20th century pastoralism of English composers such as Ralph Vaughan Williams, Whitacre had written October for wind orchestra in 2000. A decade later, Nevada-born Whitacre, who describes himself as spiritual rather than religious, decided to set liturgical text to music for the first time, choosing the words Alleluia and Amen and uniting them with October, whose simplicity and elegance transferred well to a choral setting. Alleluia retains many aspects from the choral tradition that make it just as gratifying to sing as to listen to, richly ringing harmonies, phrases that fit well with natural breath, and allusions to ancient chant and Renaissance polyphony. Yet, in its mysterious folk-like opening, and the way harmonies are used as resonating chambers for the solo lines, it also achieves a contemporary sound. Eric Whittaker, pictured here in 2011 at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, Britain, while composer in residence, was inspired to write Alleluia by his work with the chapel choir. See also, Canticum Canticorum Monteverdi's Vespers Street Matthew Passion Elijah The Dream of Gerontius.